He was the first guy to be proud to be an American.
If you live in a town that doesn't have a Washington Street, look at the map again.
Ball Washington. I will cross the river and murder you. Hey there. Welcome to the Presiquential Podcast, where we go from 1 to 45 and under 90 and discuss the life, legacy, and little-known facts about every American president. I'm your host, Ryan Allworth, joined as always by today a very bearded co-host, Blaine Zimmerman. Blaine, that is bushy.
Been working on it for a while.
Yeah, how long have you been growing that guy out?
2 months.
Wow. When are you shaving it?
I don't know yet.
How's your wife feel about it?
She's fine.
Yeah, she's okay with it?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, and our producer extraordinaire and vice presidential expert has air quotes around it, Russ Slivka, also very bearded. Russ, I've never not seen you without a beard. It's beautiful.
Thank you. I've been growing it since elementary school.
Wow, that's impressive. Guys, how excited are you to dive into the life of George Washington tonight?
I hope we have enough time.
I know. We got to keep trucking with this intro. Blaine, besides texting me which presidential biography I need to read next, you also named the episodes of the Presiquential Podcast. What are we calling episode 1 on George Washington?
The Father.
Oh, I like that. The Father. That's from Home Alone, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Credit card, you got it. We read Washington A Life by Ron Chernow. Wow, what a way to get out of the gate on the journey of presidential biographies. 813 pages long?
Yep, written in 2010.
Gosh.
Same author that wrote Hamilton.
And Grant.
And Grant, yeah.
Grant,
so
yeah.
We'll see Ronnie again.
Ronnie Chernow.
Yeah.
We also, every episode, we like to enjoy a cocktail while we're recording. In honor of George Washington, we are sipping on, Russ, what are we sipping on tonight?
It is a Horse Soldier bourbon.
A straight bourbon whiskey. Where is this made?
Columbus, Ohio.
Columbus, Ohio, the Buckeye State. We are in the Hoosier State, just right next door. George Washington was an expert horseman.
Correct.
Thomas Jefferson called him, I don't know the quote, but he called him a fantastic guy on a horse.
Yeah, he was good on him.
Yeah, he was.
I think that was the quote.
Fantastic.
They said, Thomas, how was George Washington on a horse? And he said, he was good on him.
He was good on him. He was really good.
Yeah.
What do you guys remember about George Washington from social studies?
Okay. Chop down a cherry tree, wooden teeth, and wig.
Okay, keep going. Russ, what would you add to that?
First president of the United States.
Yes.
Well, sure.
Dollar bill, quarter.
Boat painting.
Across the Delaware, yeah. Big obelisk.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Giant obelisk.
In the
Indeed.
Capitol.
Yeah. Currently, some statues of him are getting pulled down, or have been being pulled down because he was a slave owner. Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, created America.
Correct. He's the father of the country.
He is. That's why we're calling it the Father.
Yeah. Also, none of mine facts are true, as we will learn.
We are not experts. We're not experts.
Just those are things you learn about when you're a child.
Yes.
And as we learned in this book, none of those things were true.
Yes.
Which is why I brought them up.
Yeah, he was a mythical. There's like an icon status of George Washington, and then there's the real George Washington.
Yeah. Even when he was alive, there was a mythical.
He kind of played into it every once in a while.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, cheers, boys.
Yep.
This is Horse Soldier bourbon whiskey that we're drinking in honor of George Washington. Cheers to you. If this is your first time ever listening to the Presiquential Podcast, you guys ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
All right. Well, we often see George's birthday as February 22nd, 1732, but Washington was actually born on February 11th, 1731, to Augustine and Mary Ball Washington at Wakefield Farm, Westmoreland County, Virginia. When the colonies switched to the Gregorian calendar from the Julian calendar, his birthday was moved 11 days. So that's why you see it on February 22nd, 1732. Blaine, why are you laughing?
Just
when I said the word ball, you kind of got a little chuckling.
No, Mary Ball Washington.
Uh-huh.
She was an interesting person.
She was. Yeah, she's iron-willed.
Yeah.
Iron-willed.
Not the dog.
No.
He actually,
Sorry.
like, really early in life, said that he wanted to be the opposite of his mother.
Yeah.
And people have said that the most formidable general George ever encountered was Mary Ball Washington.
Yeah. Now I get it.
That's how you said it.
I said Mary Ball Washington.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That is, she does persist in the
does.
story, though,
Yeah.
of not being a great human being.
God, she kind of just nagged at him a lot.
Tried to, like, hinder his career so he couldn't go away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You always just want to go off to war.
Yeah. I need people here to
Yeah.
do work so I don't have to.
Well, here's the deal. His dad died in 1743 when he was 11, leaving Mary Ball Washington to raise their 5 children and run the family farm by herself.
Yeah. So, interesting side note on Washington.
Go ahead.
Grew up without a father and had no children of his own. So the fact that he becomes the father of our country,
Yes.
holds a little bit extra weight.
And I think a lot of people liked that, knowing that there was no risk of inherited title with him, as they were trying to avoid a monarchy 2.0
Yep.
in this American experiment. They didn't have to worry about that. Well, at 16, George leaves Mary behind and begins a career as a surveyor on behalf of a prominent Virginia landowner, Lord Thomas Fairfax. Soon after, he inherited the rights to the Mount Vernon plantation upon the death of his older brother, Lawrence. At 22, having never seen combat before, George led an outfit of 40 Virginia forces and native allies against the French in the upper Ohio River Valley, and inadvertently sparked a world war. Who fired the first shot remains in dispute, but at the end of a 15-minute skirmish, at least 10 French soldiers and a minor French noble, Joseph Colon de Villers du Jumonville, that's his entire name and title, he was on a diplomatic mission. Well, they were all brained and scalped and dead. Washington
was
a minor French noble. I don't know if
he
that's...
was a French noble that was a child?
I think he was a lesser French noble.
Okay.
He's an 8-year-old French
Or he's a noble of the French mines?
Oh yeah, he's a lesser known.
Got it.
Yeah. Anyway, Washington's branded as an assassin by the French, and the conflict between the French and the British escalated into the French and Indian War and soon spread worldwide into what became known as the 7 Years' War. So at 22, George is already having a worldwide impact. The Battle of Fort Necessity that followed shortly after was a disaster for George. On July 3rd, 1754, a mix of French and Indian fighters overwhelmed Washington's outnumbered men in their small, flimsy Fort Necessity, which was essentially a tall, round fence in an open field. Blaine, you're a National Guardsman. Is that the correct title?
Sure.
You're an officer in the Army. Did anything jump out to you in the Battle of Fort Necessity as you were reading Washington Alive by Ron Chernow?
Well, outside of the fact that he started his career with a loss, and he continued accruing them for a while.
Yeah.
He really tried hard to be a British officer, and they kept Heismaning him.
Yeah, just constantly getting rebuffed.
Yeah.
Which, spoiler alert, they're going to pay for.
Turns out bad for the Brits.
Yeah, that's right. Go ahead.
No, that's it.
All right. In 1758, he commanded 700 men as part of a force that defeated the French as Colonel George Washington. Shortly thereafter, he resigned commission as commander of Virginia colonial forces to attend to private matters at Mount Vernon. Now he's a war hero, and he easily wins election to the Virginia House of Burgesses.
Without a wig. This is about where the book introduces that part. Never wore a wig.
Never.
He just powdered his hair.
Yeah. His hair was naturally reddish-brown color. Mm-hmm. And he just liked to powder it up.
Yeah.
Tie it back in a queue. Never wore a wig. Blaine, that's very astute of you.
You can read.
Well, actually, he never wore a wig. On January 6, 1759, he marries one of the richest women in the state of Virginia, Martha Dandridge Custis, and assumed care of her children, Martha and John. Martha was a 27-year-old widow who inherited thousands of acres, 300 slaves, and other valuable property when her wealthy plantation owner husband died. For the next decade, Washington was basically farming, expanding the property around Mount Vernon, thank you, as tensions were building between Great Britain and her colonies.
He really had a knack for understanding how to move up in the world. I mean, you talked a little bit about how Fairfax, brought him on as a surveyor after unsuccessfully trying to get him into the British Navy. So he understood, like, if he kind of nestles in with the Fairfax family, kind of ups the stakes or ups his, status in the world. And then he understood that the Custis family was higher than his.
Correct.
And that the best thing to do as an adult male at that time was marry up.
Yeah.
And so he married up, and then he got the inheritance from his sister.
Yes.
When she got married, because she had to give up the inheritance and gave it to him. So he just, like, I don't know if it's luck or skill, but he had a knack to really, like, figure out how to position himself successfully to just continue to move up.
It could have been a combination of both. He knew he was a good dancer. He knew he looked good. He was a very tall man.
Oh, women really like George White. He would have been on the cover of Tiger Beat.
GQ.
Yeah. No, that works too.
George Quarterly. You guys remember what happened on March 5th, 1770?
No.
Up in Massachusetts?
Oh, is this Boston Massacre?
It is the Boston Massacre.
Right.
Or the incident on King Street, if you're British.
Oh, they do that Civil War thing?
Yeah.
The
War of Northern Aggression.
Yeah.
No, it's actually the Civil War. The Boston Massacre deepens the colonists' hatred of the British and sets the two sides on the course for war. 4 years later, in 1774, Washington served as a delegate from Virginia in the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Other delegates included John Adams, his cousin Samuel Adams, Patrick Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death Henry, and other famous founding fathers.
William Harrison? Which Harrison?
I'm sorry?
One of the
William
Henry Harrison's father.
Yes. Maybe was it his father?
I think it was his father. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll get more into that in episode 9.
I think it was Benjamin. I think it was the original Benjamin Harrison.
Could have been. I feel like it was William Henry the fifth. I don't know.
Either way, he carried little John Hancock in the chair.
That's right.
Yeah.
He did. Oh,
Yeah.
I forgot about that.
Yeah.
We'll get more into that in episode 9.
Yeah.
Down the line a little bit. Washington held his seat in the House of Burgesses back home in Virginia until 1775, when the American Revolution began on April 19th with the battles of... Remember?
What? Yorktown?
What were the battles? April 19th, 1775. What were the two battles that sparked the American Revolutionary War?
Monmouth?
Nope.
You're putting me on the spot.
Really?
Dude.
It's okay.
Sorry.
Lexington and Concord.
Of course. That's what I said.
No, I won't play back what you actually said. 2 months later...
I said Lexington and Concord.
I think you said Monmouth, and first you said Yorktown.
You believe in
Go ahead.
Lexington?
You have a tactic with conspiracy theorists that you just you go over their head, don't
Yeah.
you? Give me an example.
I just did.
Give me another
The
one.
Revolutionary War never happened.
Oh, you believe in the revolution. Okay. All right. 2 months later, during the Second Continental Congress, fellow delegate John Adams of Boston nominates Washington to be appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army on June 15, 1775. Washington left the room while his fellow delegates decided upon his appointment over John Hancock of Boston. John thought it was going to be him. George said, I'm going to sit this one out. And they appointed him commander-in-chief of the army. Much of the fighting throughout the rest of 17...
He walked away.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it was like uncouth
Right.
to be there when you were... to be in the room where it happened.
Oh, gosh. Drink.
And so...
we have this thing that you have to drink every time Blaine makes a Hamilton reference.
So when he realized he was going to be nominated, he walked out of the room.
Yeah.
And that, you'll see, tends to be... kind of a sticking point with politicians. Like, you never ran for politics like other people ran for you.
Yeah.
You never expressed interest in wanting a position. It just happened.
If it is conferred upon me, I shall take it.
I think Garfield made a comment at one point, not the cat.
Oh, thank you for clarifying
He
that.
said, I hate Mondays.
Loved lasagna, then got killed.
Yeah.
That's right.
He made a comment at one point that, like, no man has ever become president that has wanted to become president, which is obviously untrue now, but at the time, it made sense.
Yeah. I should mention that Blaine
That's
is
a paraphrase.
You're like 27 books in front of all of us.
20.
Yeah. So anytime Blaine references a future president on the episode we're on, it's because he's currently reading that
Which
book.
is why my notes are all jumbled and I don't remember things like Lexington and Concord.
That's okay. Or Yorktown or Monmouth.
Look, to be fair, I wasn't paying attention.
No, that's
and you were like, battles, and I was like, Yorktown.
Iwo Jima. Anyway, much of the fighting throughout the rest of 1775 into 1776 is taking place in New England and Quebec. All right, we're flash forwarding to 1776. Top of the year, January, Washington learns that the British are shifting their strategy from Boston to New York City. On the 6th anniversary of the Boston Massacre, March 4th and 5th, 1776, Washington and his troops pulled off a tactical miracle overnight and defeated General Howe's army at the Battle of Dorchester Heights in Boston, causing the British to evacuate the city 12 days later. Do you remember this from the book?
You
this
think
was a
they
really
say that? You think they say Dorchester?
Dorchester.
Yeah.
Dorchester. Dosta.
Yeah, Worcestershire.
Ah, the Battle of Dosta Heights. Just take out all the syllables.
Massachusetts.
There's a D, there's an S, there's an R.
Yeah.
Dosta Heights. The battle included one of the most stupendous feats of logistics, thanks to Colonel Henry Knox. Over the course of 3 winter months, Knox and his men moved the 60 tons of cannons captured by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold at Ticonderoga by boat, horse, and ox, and sheer manpower, across poor quality roads, through the mud, through frozen rivers, forests, and swamps, and they get it to the top of this hill over the cover of night. And basically fool the British. And the British wake up to realize, what did the Americans just do? And I love that military tactical brilliance of Washington there. That was kind of cool.
And then Ethan Allen went on to make
furniture,
high-end
couches, nightstands, and the likes. And Benedict Arnold just became...
Oh, we'll talk about him.
Benedict Arnold.
And we will talk more about the Boston Massacre in the next episode.
Yes, we will. That's right.
So, for those of you wondering why we're breezing through this and we're already up to 1776, Washington's a 2-termer. We've got a lot to get through in under 90 minutes.
That's right.
And we do cover a lot of the Revolutionary War in upcoming episodes.
Yeah, if you really want to dive into it, and maybe we can put this in the show notes, read 1776 by David McCullough.
Yeah, it's a really good, concise way of putting everything into one book, into one narrative,
Washington arrives in New York City in April, as do the Howe brothers, General and Admiral Howe from England, shortly after him in June, along with an armada of 400 British ships and 20,000 soldiers.
And Howe.
We'll take those Americans while trying to... That wasn't even a British accent at all. No, it wasn't. I need some more horse soldier, by the way. Can someone pour me some more horse soldier? While trying to hold New York City on July 2nd, 1776, Washington tried to rouse his untried men with these words. I love this quote. The time is now near at hand which must probably determine whether Americans are to be free men or slaves. The fate of unborn millions will now depend, under God, on the courage of this army. Talk about a good speech right there.
And somebody in the back was like, what about the slaves that are already here?
Yeah.
They were
you
like,
own slaves, don't you?
Yeah.
What did he say? I don't know. The final text of the Declaration of Independence was approved 2 days later on July 4th by Congress. On July 6th, Washington received a copy of it from John Hancock and read it to his troops 3 days later on July 9th. Huzzah, the soldiers said, before sprinting down Broadway and toppling the equestrian statue of King George III.
Oh, so that's not new?
No, they decapitated it. Then they paraded the head around New York City to fifes and drums.
So they canceled him.
They did.
Yeah.
They were like, we have to put this on Instagram. What's Instagram? The 4,000 pounds of lead in the statue was melted down to make 42,088 musket balls.
Yeah. That's where Mel Gibson got the idea.
In The Patriot?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's probably where it came from.
That's where the term baller move came from, actually.
No.
Washington, however, was abhorred by the disorder and vandalism and refused to abide the desecration of the king's statue. On July 14th, the brothers, General and Admiral Howe, attempted to contact Washington to open negotiations, but Washington, I love this, refused their letter, which was addressed to George Washington, Esquire, etc., which was a form of address appropriate for a private gentleman rather than for the commander of an army. I love that. He was like, I'm not even going to look at that letter unless it says General.
Sorry, too many etceteras for me.
Sorry. I do like the Esquire, though. I'll keep that. In late August, during a heavy night fog, Washington and his army silently evacuate Long Island by boat to Manhattan, escaping almost certain capture. Only after some 9,500 men have been safely ferried across the East River did Washington board the last boat and join them. Later in October, New York City would fall into British hands, and for much of November and December of 1776, Washington and his men were on the run throughout New Jersey.
John Adamsley famously says, in general, our generals have generally been out-generaled.
I'm sorry. So that sounds like from Pirates of the Penzance, some song lyric that I've never heard of.
In general, our generals have been out-generaled. I think
like
I
John
added
Adams,
it generally the first time.
That's okay. I feel like John Adams was just trying to be smart there.
He was?
Yeah.
No, I'm like, he was smart.
Oh, yeah. That was a period, not a question mark. Okay. I love this. Probably one of the most famous and frankly pretty badass military moments of American history happened on Christmas Day, 1776, when Washington, Knox, and 2,400 American troops crossed the Delaware River in freezing weather to launch a surprise attack on the British and Hessian mercenaries encamped at Trenton, New Jersey. In the early morning hours of December 26th, the attack begins, and after a short battle, Washington's army takes Trenton. Huzzah, the soldiers said again, to Washington. Also, Merry Christmas.
Yeah, that was, I mean, whew.
I love that.
We will murder you in your sleep on Christmas.
On Christmas. Yeah.
That's
it's a boss move.
The famous painting, it's on a pair of my shorts.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of my favorite paintings ever.
It's pretty awesome.
And
we'll get also into that painting in number 5 with James Monroe. Foreshadowing alert, because Monroe was there.
Oh, yes, correct.
Yes,
yeah.
He advanced. Yeah. Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves. All right, we got to keep flying. In 1777, 19-year-old Marquis de Lafayette,
who was generally loved by everyone.
Everyone liked
America's favorite fighting Frenchman.
Sounds like a bumper sticker in Alabama.
I mean, pretty much every account of this entire era, of anyone that's met Lafayette. Like, at one point, Washington wrote a love letter to him.
Yeah.
Like, just outpouring.
I think Lafayette eventually named his son after George
Washington Lafayette. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was after
years
the prison
later.
thing.
Yeah.
His personal bodyguards, did we talk about that during the war?
Oh, go ahead.
Because I don't know if we're skipping over the attempted assassination via Pease.
Oh, please! You're on the subject. Let's talk about it.
So, a couple things just about the war while we have a little break in time here.
Okay.
One, his personal security team were called lifeguards, and I feel like that probably held a lot more weight than it does now.
Yeah,
like
for sure.
At some point when the Secret Service came in and they were like, "We're gonna take over for this," and the lifeguards are like, "What do we do?" And they're like, "I don't know. Go watch those kids in that pool.
Yeah, go blow your whistle and look at your phone.
Like, here, have some more sunscreen on your nose. Don't worry, you'll get a tall chair."
That's great.
But a member of his security team was in an assassination plot against him, which I believe was also perpetuated by Benedict Arnold. Correct?
Could have been.
Was that the same one?
I think this was the
They
one
tried
that
to poison his peas.
that Washington had publicly executed in front of like 20,000 troops. He was
killed
like
that lifeguard.
Yeah, he's like, everyone's gonna watch this.
He also was like really strict with his soldiers.
He was.
Like, he had really strict. He would whip them, or whatever they called it at the time. He would whip them.
Yeah.
And the term "bite the bullet" came from his soldiers. Essentially, when they would get hungry, so they would like raid somebody's barn, and take blankets and food and stuff, and they would get to a point where they knew, because Washington didn't want them, pillaging their own people, but he couldn't get enough funds from Congress to pay them and feed them and clothe them, so they got to certain points where they would be like, all right, look, I'm gonna bite the bullet here, and I'm just gonna eat and be full and then take my whipping. And then when they would get whipped, they would take their bullets from their muskets and bite them to withstand the pain.
Wow. Learn something new every time you listen to the Presiquential Podcast, or Blaine just makes something up. I think that's factual, though, from the book.
Yeah,
that's not fake news.
There are too many people that listen to this that know so much more about this stuff than we do, that if I try to make something up, we'd get at least 2 angry emails.
Oh, we just got an email from George Washington the 14th at hotmail.com. Wow,
he was a big fan of trying to kidnap people as well. I might be getting ahead of the story, but he really tried.
Okay.
He was a big fan.
Yeah. Well, Lafayette shows up. Everyone loves him, develops a very close friendship with Washington. There's a ton of fighting. He hunkers down for the winter of 1777 with 12,000 men at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia, which was just a horrendous winter, to say the least. It almost broke the spirit of the army. Finally, in 1781, all right, so we're going a little bit ahead, after facing mutinies and other hardships, Washington defeats General Cornwallis at Blaine.
What?
It was your first guess ever.
Yorktown.
Hey, thanks for that.
I was reading my notes again. It's like he's on a roll. I got time to read ahead.
Normandy.
You said Blaine, and I was like, I don't know what we're talking
I
about.
have no idea. What's your name again? Also, thanks for the help, France, because they prevented they shut off the harbor there, and I think Lafayette prevented the southern retreat of Cornwallis. I could be wrong, and then I think Washington came from the north. So they basically had him cornered.
They basically just kept taking like berm by berm. And they just kept moving forward and moving forward and moving forward.
And then
Hamilton
that white
was
flag.
involved.
Hamilton was.
Yeah.
Hamilton, I think, was also at Monmouth, I believe. I can't remember. Yeah. Anyway,
we're bad with battle names.
That's okay.
Yeah, this is a president podcast, not a Revolutionary War podcast.
That's a good point. The Treaty of Paris is signed 2 years later on September 3rd, 1783. Washington resigns as commander-in-chief in late December 1783 and returns home to Mount Vernon. Hey, on that note, we're going to refresh our beverages and let you hear from one of our fantastic sponsors before we dive into Washington's presidency. You're listening to Episode 1, the father of the Presiquential Podcast. We'll be right back.
Hey guys, it's Blaine. And for our fans with an interest in a more modern military history, make sure you check out our friends over at the Panjway Podcast. Panjway Podcast is an interview-based podcast that documents the experience of combat veterans in the Panjway district of Afghanistan. When I was in Afghanistan, I actually served in Zari, which is just north of Panjway, so it's pretty cool to see them document their experiences and the experiences of other American and Canadian forces that fought in the area. Be sure to check them out at thepanjwaypodcast.com. That's spelled the Panjwai podcast.com and on all major podcast platforms. That's the Panjwai podcast.com.
Hey, welcome back. We got some fresh Horse Soldier straight bourbon whiskey. We've taken a little bit of a break, but we are back, and we're so glad you are back as well, listening to Episode 1, the father of the Presiquential Podcast. Russ, Blaine, how was that break for each of you?
It was good.
Okay, all right.
Well needed.
It was great.
Okay, wonderful. Blaine, do you have any other notes from the book that we read about Washington?
Yeah, so before we dive into the first presidency, going back a little bit to 1783, March 15th, and what is now known as the Newburgh Conspiracy.
Okay.
There were a lot of Army officers from the Revolutionary War that were upset that Congress hadn't paid them as they had promised they were going to pay them. So as we discussed before, there were pay issues, and essentially they were like, don't worry, you'll get back pay. Back pay hadn't come yet, and all of these officers had basically congregated in Philadelphia to storm Congress and demand their payment. Wow. Washington, realizing this is probably a poor move on his part and realizing that he could probably get their pay in a diplomatic fashion, has like a prepared statement that he wants to read them, and as he's about to read it, he realizes that he can't, because he can't see it that well. So as he's pulling his glasses out of his coat pocket, he says, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service, and now I find myself going blind." And they basically, like, all started crying, and they were like, you know what? We're good. Like, he's right. We're going to let you handle this.
I love that.
Yeah. And just that small, like, comment as he pulled his glasses out, like, just killed the room.
I love that, man. 1783. What was the name? What was the event
Newburgh
called?
Conspiracy.
Okay.
Newburgh.
You can check that out if you want to learn more about that. The summer of 1787, so 4 years after the Newburgh Conspiracy, Washington is elected to preside over the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. At that point, we had been basically run by the Articles of Confederation, which were pretty lackluster. We needed a lot more stable of a document. So the new Constitution goes through the ratification process, finally becomes the law of the land in June 1788. Congress calls for elections in late 1788 and early 1789. To head the newly established executive branch of the government, 69 electors from 10 states unanimously choose Washington as the nation's first president on February 4th, 1789, while John Adams got the most votes of any vice presidential contender. Alexander Hamilton... Drink.
Oh, okay.
I didn't make the reference, but every time we mention Hamilton. Had suggested privately to a few electors that they withhold votes from Adams to ensure Washington's victory. Adams, very vain and thin-skinned, was thoroughly pissed when Hamilton when he found out about his duplicity, which poisoned future relations between the two, which we'll probably dive into in episode 2. All right, so Washington takes the oath of office and is inaugurated as president in New York City, then the nation's capital, on April 30th, 1789. And as the first chief executive of America, Washington is well aware that he's going to be setting numerous precedents for his successors. Okay, so he becomes the first president in almost everything, literally the first president in everything. But he established the tradition of delivering a State of the Union address to Congress annually and in person. The Constitution at the time just called for the president to update the Congress, quote, from time to time, end quote. Washington was the guy who's like, we're going to do this every year. I'm going to do it in person. I'm not just going to send a letter to Congress.
However, previous presidents didn't always do that in person. Sometimes they would just send their State of the Union to Congress to be read.
By, I would presume, the Speaker of the House?
Yeah, or the Vice President, yeah.
Or the Vice President,
Yeah.
Okay. On April 5th, 1792, Washington exercises his first ever presidential veto. American presidents to date have used their veto power more than, let's take a guess. Russ, how many times do you think American presidents to date since Washington have used the veto power?
You're saying total?
Yeah.
Or per president?
Total.
Okay.
Hundreds.
Okay. All right. That's kind of ballpark.
Okay, so there's 45. Some presidents have vetoed a lot. I'm going to say 273.
Multiply that by about 10.
Oh, wow.
2,500 times the veto power has been used. Washington, of course, was the first to ever use it, however, several years after he became president. Although he had doubts about continuing in an office and yearned to return to private life at Mount Vernon, Jefferson, Hamilton, among others, persuaded him to stay for the good of the country. On February 3rd, 1793, he is unanimously reelected for the presidency. John Adams again is reelected vice president.
I would like to know a little bit more about John Adams, the vice president.
As the vice president?
Yeah. Huh. Do we know anyone that could give us...
Russ, do you have something to say about the Vice President John Adams?
Sure, I can provide a little information.
Please do.
John Adams, as the vice president, was not very accustomed to being the president of the Senate. So he was more accustomed to debating rather than presiding over a debate. So he was a little uncomfortable with that.
How good of a debater was he? Would you say he was an amateur debater? Or
I would say he was the master of debaters.
Did he have any ideas for the presidency?
He did. While he was the head of the Senate, one of the issues that came up is, what do we call the president? There was a Senate committee, and their result was they wanted to call him His Highness, the President of the United States of America and Protector of the Rights of the Senate.
Wow. Just rolls off the tongue.
Yeah.
Rolls off the tongue.
Decided to not go with that?
They decided to not go with that. And in this case, even though the vice president is supposed to stay out of any debates,
go on.
John Adams did hop into this one and instead offered His Majesty the President.
Oh my! He went
a great
His
Decemberist
Majesty.
album.
I'm sorry, what?
It's a great Decemberist album.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. He was actually ridiculed for this.
Well, I hope he would be.
Yeah, of course. Well, he was ridiculed for even
Lots of stuff.
offering his opinion.
They called him, what was the thing?
His rotundity.
John Adams.
Yeah.
Man.
There was a senator, William McClay, that mocked him and his presiding over the Senate, saying, "I cannot help thinking of a monkey put into breeches."
Wow.
Breeches.
They were
britches.
They were breeches back then.
Well, Grandma Fox said britches. This was britches.
Grandma Fox.
She was never wrong.
Was she in the Congress as well?
She might have been.
She was there.
Wow. All right. So he's vice president. Essentially, does not much except side with the party line.
Basically,
Okay.
break any ties.
Yeah.
Well, if he was rotundity, maybe he was too big for his britches.
His breeches.
Breaches. Man. Well, Russ, thank you as always, not just for producing the show, having a glorious beard, but also bringing the vice presidential knowledge. I mean, I think the people listening to this gained
2, maybe 3.
just a little bit of information that you just shared.
That's what I offer.
Nuggets upon nuggets that they could glean from that. Well, for Washington's second inaugural address, he delivers the shortest inaugural speech on record, a compact 135 words, in a ceremony intended as the antithesis of monarchical extravagance. Say that 5 times fast. There was no precedent for swearing in of an incumbent president. They had no idea what to do. And we're going to get this into episode 4. You want to talk a little bit, Blaine, about that inaugural address?
Well, no, the one you're talking about was his first.
Oh, the first one. Do you want to talk about that one?
His first inaugural address was written by James Madison.
Maybe you've heard of him.
And then the response from the Senate was also written by James Madison.
Yes.
And then the response from George Washington to the Senate's response was also written by James Madison.
I love it.
So
man.
he
Gosh,
essentially had one of those arguments in the shower you have with yourself,
With
where you
himself.
get all the answers right.
It was a tiny shower.
Yeah.
Let's be honest.
Oh, yeah.
Very small.
Yeah.
Oh, man. On August 18th, 1795, Washington signed Jay's Treaty with Great Britain, named after John Jay, which stabilized American-British relations until the War of 1812. On December 7th, 1796, Washington makes his final address to Congress in Philadelphia, which was well received by all in attendance except the lone congressman from Tennessee, future 7th President Andrew Jackson, who was enraged by the Jay Treaty and refused to salute to the departing chief or join in applause.
He didn't stand either.
He did.
So
not
he was
stand.
the first. So the people that you see now during the State of the Union that don't stand, you can chalk that one up to Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson,
Yeah.
man. That's part of this journey that I love is that, and in full transparency, we are reading books beyond the current episode as we have to. But I personally love seeing...
What's the term? You have a term for it.
What?
The term with the
musical term?
The Jesus term.
Oh, when Jesus shows up in the Old Testament, it's called a theophany.
Yes,
yeah,
of course.
And so somewhat of a you're seeing where they overlap. Foreshadowing, yes.
That's the word you're looking for.
Yes, it is. Thank you. But
theophany.
I love seeing future presidents in the current president's story.
There's some fun ones too.
Lincoln was there on the House floor when John Quincy Adams, President number 6, dies. Literally on the House of the floor. But Washington was a freshman congressman from Springfield.
Lincoln. He died on the floor of the House.
Yes.
Lincoln was a freshman.
Lincoln was the freshman. I'm sorry, I've had like 4 horse soldiers.
After Lincoln's first term, I believe, Millard Fillmore partied with him. Isn't that right? Do I have that backwards? Was it Van Buren?
I thought Van Buren
That's what
was
it is.
like...
So Van Buren and Fillmore are equally milquetoast. Van Buren post-presidency parties with Lincoln at one point, who is yet to be a congressman, or he's a congressman elect.
I think he might have been a congressman elect.
And he was like, I like this kid.
Yeah, this tall, skinny guy.
Wrestling everybody.
What's Illinois again? What is that? That's a state out west?
It was crazy. We had like 2 hard ciders. He was out wrestling the town.
He said, I need this next hard cider like a hole in the head.
Oh.
Foreshadowing.
Too soon.
Sorry. I just like that, where you see the future presidents showing up in each other president's story. Okay, so John Adams, thank you, Russ, for, again, that amazing Oscar-worthy performance of sharing about John Adams. March 4th, 1797, Washington ended the inauguration ceremony of John Adams with an exquisite gesture. He insisted that President Adams and Vice President Thomas Jefferson exit the chamber before him, a perfect symbol that the nation's most powerful man had now reverted to the humble status of a private citizen.
So, we just rushed really quickly through his presidency, and there's some things that we need to go back.
Please, open it up.
One was that Lafayette, at some point in there, gifted him some dogs.
Yes, he did.
And John Quincy Adams was the escort for those dogs.
Yes. Like he had 8 dogs that he had to chaperone.
Yeah.
For George.
Across the Atlantic, riding vociferously.
Oh, yeah.
So there's... Washington was strongly opposed to the Bill of Rights. He only reluctantly agreed to them because he thought that the Declaration of Independence should have covered everything. Or the original Constitution. The original Constitution covered everything, and all the things that the Bill of Rights explicitly stated he felt were covered enough.
Also written by James
Madison.
And the response to the Bill of Rights.
But the Bill of Rights was actually written by Governor Morris.
Governor, of Philadelphia, I believe.
Yeah.
Its actually original name was the William of Rights.
Governor Morris from New York.
That flew over your head.
Yeah, no. He's from New York.
Oh, I'm sorry. My bad.
He signed the first proclamation for Thanksgiving in 1789.
I didn't know that.
There were the moving of the capital to a place near Mount Vernon, which was something that Washington pretty strongly financially benefited from, was about the only time in his presidency outside of the Jay Treaty that people felt like it was openly okay to criticize him.
And that was involved with the Madison, Hamilton, Jefferson in the room where it happened thing, right? Where that was part of the compromise.
Dinner. Yeah. So moving it at the time from Philadelphia to what we know of today as Washington, there was some...
I thought it was New York City for a while. Wasn't it Philly, then New York, then D.C.?
Maybe, but...
Regardless.
Yeah.
Potato.
Yeah. So moving it to Washington, there was a lot of financial incentive for George Washington to move it that close to Mount Vernon because of some of the the land that he inherited.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about this yet, but we don't want to look at too many things through today's lens.
Correct.
Right. But there is a relatively hypocritical side of Washington when it comes to slavery. So he owned slaves. He always was conflicted about that. He freed them in his will, and it turns out Martha wasn't cool with that. So they weren't really freed. But while he was openly against slavery, the things that he did personally were very contradictory to his statements. So, for example, he had a few slaves that were runaway, and he went to great lengths to find them and bring them back.
Ona Judge, if you remember this story. And there's a great book called Never Caught, The Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge, by Erica Dunbar. That's a great book. It basically talks about how the lengths that... I think she was Martha's slave.
Yeah.
I believe.
Well, she was a custis. It was...
Correct.
Remember, because that was one of the reasons why he could never free his slaves.
That's right.
Was because he would have owed the Custis family dowry for the output that they should have produced or whatever. And so she was a Custis slave. So the other one was the example of the slaves that he brought to the Capitol building.
Oh, yes. That was during Philadelphia. Yeah.
Yeah. So Pennsylvania was one of the first states to abolish slavery in the Union. And they had a law that if a slave lived in Pennsylvania for more than 6 months, they became free.
Yes.
So when he was serving as president there, he would send his slaves home after 5 months and tell them, like, oh, no, I'm sending you home so you can see your family. knowing that as soon as they crossed the border, their time started over.
Yeah.
So then he'd bring them back, and then so he knew his ways around the law to continue. Because I think his name was Billy, his cook.
Yes, it was his favorite enslaved person at Mount Vernon.
He was one of the ones that caught on to what was happening.
Yeah, where was it? I've
kind
got
of
it in
turned
here
on
somewhere.
him, and then he ended up like telling stories for the rest of his life of being a Washington slave.
Yeah,
kind of made a career out of it.
Yeah.
But there were also other things that he did in the time that would be considered, morally righteous. Like he didn't sell slaves away from their families.
Correct.
And things like that. So it's a weird, tricky, and like I said, we don't want to look at 1770, 1780 in today's light.
Yeah.
But it's at least worth mentioning the hypocritical side of it.
Right.
That, like, he said one thing, he talked out of one side of his mouth.
Yeah.
And did things in a little bit different way. It doesn't take away from all of his accomplishments by any means. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying go tear down his statues.
Sure.
That's not where I'm going with that. It's just I think those are important pieces to point out.
Yeah, I think it is too. We're going to dive into a lot of this in this journey of what is the history, what does the presidency even mean in this American experiment of 200 plus years. Before we take our next break, this was interesting in this book when I did not know this, but now President John Adams names Washington commander of a new army created in anticipation of a war with France without Washington even knowing it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That was he said, I'm naming my generals.
Yeah.
And Adams was like, cool, but not Hamilton.
Yeah.
And he was like, no, he's the number one general. And he was like, okay, here's what I'm going to do. He can be general, but he's number 4. And Washington's like, that's not how this is going. And then there wasn't a war, so it didn't matter.
Well, listen, we're going to dive into Washington's death, legacy, and little-known facts about him. One of our favorite segments of this podcast that we've been creating. We're going to take a break, refresh our Horse Soldier straight bourbon whiskey, and we'll be right back. You're listening to the Presiquential Podcast. Facing the transition out of the military is rarely easy. It doesn't help that the staggering number of options you're faced with can be overwhelming. But there's a light at the end of that tunnel for all veterans, and that light shines brightest here in Indiana. Lucrative careers in fast-growing industries are plentiful. Housing costs are amongst the lowest in the nation, and you can live in the country while being less than an hour from a world-class city. At InVets, we're showing veterans how to translate the valuable skills they've learned to the civilian world while connecting them with careers they can be proud of so they can lead fulfilling, purposeful lives. Go to InVets, that's INVETS.org. Create a profile to learn more about Indiana communities, browse the current open job openings in these communities, and receive your free shirt. That's InVets, INVETS.org. We're back. You're listening to episode 1 of the Presiquential Podcast, The Father on George Washington. Washington dies December 12th, 1799. He wrote his own will without any legal assistance, and he directed that when his wife dies, all his slaves were to be freed. Washington also directed that the young enslaved people at Mount Vernon were to be taught to read and write, and that the elderly ones be provided with food and clothing. He almost died from medical malpractice as opposed to what he actually died from, which was, for more or less, a bad cold. I mean, he had gone out and surveyed his lands at Mount Vernon. He'd done that 2 days in a row in horrible winter weather, was complaining about a sore throat. He has trouble breathing, but his doctors, his doctors bled out 5 pints of his blood.
Yeah, there were only 2 real things to do in that. There was do some cocaine or let's take some blood out. Like, those are the 2 treatments for anything.
You guys want to do some lines put on Steely Dan? Who's Steely Dan?
He had almost died before that, though.
Oh my gosh.
Like, the country was preparing. It was actually while he was president, because they weren't sure what to do.
Well, not to mention, we didn't go into this, too, Blaine. Remember that. But he had several horses shot out from under him in his early battles. I mean, he had escaped death numerous times on the battlefield.
Yeah. Well, back all the way to the French and Indian War, the Indians basically thought that he was protected by his shaman because there were multiple times during the French and Indian War where there was gunfire all around him and he was completely unscathed, he and his horse.
Gosh.
And it's one of those the things that the Indians of the time thought, you know, the commander has a protective spell on him, and so he must be like super magic, and they revered him. Yeah, they thought he was like this amazing, great commander, which they're not entirely wrong on. Yeah, but it wasn't magic. Yeah, that we know of.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean,
history could show
George Washington was not a Homo sapien. Have you ever read that book, The Presidents Were Aliens?
No.
Days Confused.
Okay. I need to watch that movie. That's another one of those movies that I've only seen one time. Who knew that Washington was in the House of Slytherin and escaped death through black magic?
Never seen. That's actually on my reverse bucket list.
Oh,
I know your reference, but on my reverse bucket list is I will never see a Harry Potter movie.
Oh, man. I'd seen the Harry Potter movies without reading the books, and I was so confused. I was like, what's going on here? And my wizard friend was like, well, let me tell you that. Okay, so Washington is 67 years old. His family, his nation, and the world mourned the loss of a man whose character and leadership were fundamental to establishing a nation. Apparently fearing a revolt, Martha freed Washington slaves ahead of schedule on January 1st, 1801. And in an act lamented by historians ever since, Martha burned virtually all of her letters that she and George had exchanged during their courtship and 40 years of marriage. Martha died a year later on May 22nd, 1802, just shy of her 71st birthday, and was buried in the family vault on the grounds of Mount Vernon, next to her husband.
As soon as you said family vault, the first thing that came to mind was, if you remember when we were children, they would re-release old Disney movies on VHS, and they would be like, get it now before we put it back in the vault. Like, you remember that?
Yeah, like Bambi.
Yeah, they would be like, only for a limited time before it goes back into the vault.
That's right.
Which we're going to release to everyone on the internet one day, and people are like, what are you talking about?
The frozen severed head of Walt Disney protecting the vault.
Oh, man. So I do want to take a quick caveat and talk, like, we recognize how quickly we just went through George Washington's life.
Gosh.
And there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
So, as Ryan said, we like to cover life, legacy, little known facts. That's the reason we pick the books of being, you know, their whole life. If you've ever read the Ron Chernow book, you know, like, this is not 600 pages with lots of inserts of pictures. It's very small print. Gosh. There is a lot to get through. Yeah. We skipped a lot of things. Yeah. But we did that because there's a lot of legacy to talk about here.
Absolutely.
And there are a lot of things in our notes that we wanted to talk about, but we didn't, because we're going to still cover a lot of those things. Yeah. Like we said, 1 to 45 and under 90, we've still got quite a bit of time to cover some legacy here. So, huge takeaways, and then we'll kind of narrow them down, like the big takeaways from the legacy, because one of the things that I like about this journey is us looking at, like, how is our country different because they were president. And for somebody like Washington, it's more obvious maybe than somebody like Millard Fillmore.
Why is Millard always the one?
I don't know. People in Buffalo are probably really mad about it too, because they're like, he's our guy. Like, he like, you realize how much he meant to Buffalo, and like, we do now.
Tommy, you got any more paper towels? I'm finishing these wings. This guy's talking about Millard Fillmore over here.
That's not a Buffalo accent.
Why am I from Boston?
I'm going to throw these guys through a table.
God, it's snowing again. It's July.
That gives me PTSD.
Do you want to talk about that?
No. Okay. Upstate New York winters are real. Gosh. So, legacy about Washington, big view. Like, obviously, great leader. Obviously, a really great commander.
Leader where? Battlefield?
Yes.
Okay. How so? Because he lost a lot of battles.
He did, and that's one of the things we glossed over early. Like, he lost way more than he won.
Yeah.
He lost more times than he won.
Yeah.
But he was, we'll say, cunning enough in those losses to understand the proper way to not retreat.
Although he did that strategically at times.
Yeah,
especially when...
Exfil, if you will.
Yeah.
He understood how to move backwards in a way that was, covered up by, he would keep campfires going so it looked like the camp was still there. Mm-hmm. And, the Hows would wake up the next morning and be like, we're going to get them today. Mm-hmm. And then look over and be like, no one's there.
Yeah, and it had been muffled by hay bales that he had ordered to be laid out to muffle the sound of troops.
Yeah, he had audacity, which is one of the main things that you need as a commander of an army. He understood when to attack and how to attack. Yeah. He understood how to be an insurgent. I mean,
open that up as a military man, insurgent. Open that up.
So at the time, the British Army was the largest and grandest fighting force in the world. There's a reason there's a Union Jack on like 17 countries' flags right now.
Yeah.
They believed in this style of fighting that was, we're going to stand in this open field like men and shoot at you when we can see you. And they would literally, and they covered this in this book, they would get angry that the American soldiers would like hide behind trees and take pot shots.
Like in the Battle of Fort Necessity.
Yeah.
Right?
They would talk about how cowardly of them to stand behind trees like after they just lost the battle. Like calling the other guys cowardly.
Yeah.
But he understood like using the terrain to your advantage, not just standing out in an open field. Now, granted, they did that plenty of times, more times than they didn't, but he understood using your resources like in a way that was advantageous. I mean, if you look back he had soldiers that weren't being paid, weren't being clothed, weren't being fed, that were more than willing to stand up and go fight for him just based off small mannerisms, speeches, things like that. I mean, it takes a lot to be able to use words to convince people that are tired, cold, and hungry to go risk their lives for something that they're probably not going to see the fruits of their labor on.
God, that's amazing, man. Like, I don't know why I thought this when you were talking, but I think of the great cathedrals of Europe when they were being built, where you had generations of families building these houses of worship that they would never see completed. And in a way, Washington's army, like I think of Valley Forge in the winter of, 77, when they're, frostbitten, they're not getting paid. They have no shoes at times. Dysentery is running rampant because
they're literally putting, I'm going to get whipped if I eat, but I'm going to choose getting whipped to eat.
That's what I love about the American fighting spirit, man.
So obviously there were problems with his leadership as well.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
Maybe that's too drastic of a punishment.
Yeah. But also, I mean, it's a young fledgling country that, he's fighting Congress in a way while he's fighting the British.
But his punishments were set in a morality that we're not going to plunder our citizens to win our war.
Yeah.
So it's a weird catch-22.
One thing that I didn't know about Washington until I read really Washington, A Life by Ron Chernow, all 813 pages of it.
613 pages.
I think it was no, dude, it's 813.
813.
It's a doozy.
I have bad handwriting.
So he wasn't always a great general, but he was an excellent spy master. This is something we dove into a little bit. One could argue that Washington was more deeply involved in intelligence operations than any other president until Eisenhower during World War II. If you want to follow up on this, I recommend two things. I've read and seen them both. The first is the book by Brian Kilmeade called George Washington's Secret Six. Talks about this spy ring that he created that using invisible ink, using code words and ciphers and all these.
Love cereal. Just collected enough to get his coder ring.
It's a lousy commercial. Don't forget to drink your Ovaltine. What the hell, George? The also is the I believe it's on AMC. You can try to find it elsewhere, but. It's called Turn.
Oh yeah.
Gosh, what a good series there. But Washington was an excellent spy master. Had people embedded into New York, Boston, to really uncover these plots of the British that were subterfuge at the time.
Hercules Mulligan.
What?
Hercules Mulligan.
Hercules Mulligan. Yeah, amen
He's
to
my
that.
favorite character.
He's so good. No, I think we have to drink because you mentioned Hamilton.
The side note, like that's the part of Hamilton my kids know they're not allowed to sing.
Oh, because the
Like,
corsets.
yeah, they do
yeah.
the blah blah.
Yeah.
I am Hercules Mulligan.
Oh,
and then
stop
they
singing.
pause.
We have to owe Lin-Manuel Miranda money.
Oh no, that's my kids know that too because that's where they stop singing. They don't know what
Right.
it means, but they know they're not allowed to say it.
In a chorus of a four sets of corsets. Yeah.
But we did. I talked about this earlier. He loved kidnapping people, or the plot to kidnap people.
Yes, he did.
So he tried to kidnap.
Go ahead.
Let's see. Prince Henry, who was the son of King George, Admiral Robert Digby. He wrote most of the original Brandon series. The Big Lebowski fans will get that. I know
Go
you
ahead.
don't. Benedict Arnold and Sir Henry Clinton tried to kidnap all of them. He was a real big well, if we kidnap these important people, we'll have some leverage. And every time there was a weird comedy of errors that would happen that would have really stood up in a silent comedy.
And there's something amazing about, we didn't dive into this too much, but the Benedict Arnold saga.
Yeah.
Where Arnold captured these guns along with Ethan Allen and the Vermont Green Mountain Boys at Ticonderoga, which then defeated the British in Boston, kicked them out of the city. Then, I think, gosh, there's amazing resources out there about Benedict Arnold that you could find if you really wanted to dive into his story. But Washington and Arnold and then Major John Andre, there's an amazingly fascinating story about how the plot that Benedict Arnold had to overturn West Point to the British, literally Benedict Arnold is having breakfast with George Washington as Washington receives news that this has gone down this treasonous plot. Arnold excuses himself. His wife, or maybe fiance at the time, who was in on the plot, I think wife,
starts throwing stuff out a window, right?
going hysterics.
Yeah.
Basically allowing her new husband, traitorous husband, to escape, cross the river, and get into safety.
And then that becomes the site of our military academy.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, it's really crazy.
Yeah. Like, if you go upstate New York is anything out of New York City.
That's not upstate.
No, but anything along the Hudson, there's so many sites where Washington, when he was on the run from the British in New Jersey and New York, where he's just trying to set up camp and be like, we have to figure out how we're going to get out of this predicament very quickly.
Yeah.
To save this nation, which is still not even at that point a nation. I mean, it's a collection of colonies, right?
They were outnumbered, outmanned.
I mean, had he been caught, he easily would have been killed.
Oh.
Hanged, a traitor,
Yeah.
whatever.
They were remember how we wouldn't let you in the army?
Right.
Guess what?
But I think that's, to me, what I love about Washington's character, of his leadership, being the first in everything. Commanding the Continental Army, helping the Constitution come to form, creating this. What is the presidency? What does this even look like? This is a man who is very prescient, without knowing a lot of what is to come. I mean, can't even see maybe 20 years down the line. But I love that. What was that? July 2nd, 1776, tries to rouse his men with this concept of the fate of these unborn millions hinge on your actions today.
I do have a theory, though.
Go ahead.
I do think he knew.
Knew what?
I think he knew the ramifications of what would happen down the line and how important what he was doing was.
When he was commander or president?
When he was president.
Okay.
This is completely my theory.
Yeah.
It's probably completely unfounded and probably incorrect. But if you go back to a lot of his diary entries, he, on really important days, writes very little to nothing. Like the day he becomes the commander-in-chief of the army, the day he becomes the president of the United States, multiple and very important days. There are very little in his diary, and he almost goes out of his way in diary entries to be overly humble. I almost wonder, because of the way that manhood was seen back then, that humbleness was one of the biggest traits that was seen as being a great man.
Modesty.
Yeah, modesty.
Yeah.
That he purposefully left those out so that his legacy would be his modesty. I could be completely wrong.
Interesting.
It could have just been that he legitimately was like that.
Yeah.
But there, the way it kind of pans out, and he walks out of the room before he's named commander in chief. He always doesn't try to seek any office. It's kind of bestowed upon him.
Yeah.
I think he understood, at least in their time, that was what was seen as a great leader. And so in order to, perpetuate that, he, even in his private diaries, wouldn't write anything, because that's what you were supposed to do, knowing that in the future people would read these because he was the first president of the United States. So he knew somebody was going to read his diary.
He had a team around him too that worked 8-hour shifts, to basically capture these diary entries, all his letters. I mean, he was one of the most proficient letter writing presidents of all time.
And that modesty and not seeking, office and seeking the highest term in the land, like we talked about earlier, it goes for generations, into the late 1800s.
Yes.
Before we start seeing presidents really try to be president. I mean, we have the one outlier with William Henry Harrison, with the campaign with Tippecanoe and Tyler too.
Sure.
But even that was mostly other people campaigning for them.
Yeah.
He
was out on the trail though. WHH.
But it's,
I know what you're saying.
That modest tone of being president, like even people that really wanted to be president more than anything, outwardly would never say they were. I really want to be president.
Do you think
we're now welcomed by our fourth podcast guest,
Dirk, get comfy, man. There you go.
I'm sure that you will hear his pause and jumping on the bench in my kitchen more than once.
He's just yakking on about.
Yeah,
I love Dirk. Dirkish delight. How you doing over there, guy? You okay? All right. Do you think Washington could have seen 244 years to 2020 or 245 to 2021?
No.
I mean, what do you think? How far was he looking down the line?
I mean, maybe 100.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. I still think if he were to try to project the future, it's still he thinks they're the underdog, and he still thinks Britain owns everything.
Yeah.
That would be my guess.
Yeah. Gosh.
I mean, it's so hard to predict, something like that. But what other, main legacy points do you think we take away from Washington?
It's interesting because, I mean, the guy was called the father of his country as early as 1778.
Right, yeah. And as we talked about, for someone who didn't have a father and who it wasn't a father, he was a stepfather. Yeah. Which is an incredible feat in and of itself, to be able to step in and be the father to children that aren't yours. That's an amazing thing to do. I mean, that it speaks volume to character.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I think in 2020, 2021 that we've been living through lately. Many people are looking through the lens of Washington of he created the country. A lot of other people created the country too, but they see the one fact that he's a slave owner as the mar
pick apart,
as the mar upon his character. So therefore, dude, I'm very ambivalent about statues. Portraits.
Yeah, we're not by no means are we saying
good grief.
Let's give him a pass on the slaves.
No.
It's not what we're saying.
No, but I think to look at George Washington as only the negative, darker side of his personalities, I think it's too convenient to do that. I think it's too easy to look at him and say, okay, he did all these great things, but also without looking in the mirror at our own lives.
Yeah, and I think that I would like to think that we looked at it a little bit more fairly than that and said, here's the whole story.
Yeah.
We're not going to ignore
No.
this stuff. Not to like try to pat us on the back for that, but
No.
like looking at it from okay, here's the stuff that wasn't great
Yeah.
about his character, about his personality.
Yeah.
Here are the things that he did that persist through time.
I think for me, reading the book, again, Washington Alive by Ron Chernow, and there are dozens of books on Washington.
Yeah.
Again, our this concept with this journey of learning and exploration of the presidency and the American experiment with our podcast is less about a term or a battle or a passage of law under one president. It's more about their life, their legacy, and little known facts. To me, it was very interesting to think of everything that I tried to remember from grade school about Washington. He's a pretty mythological, iconic figure in our history for good reason. This book really helped me understand the person of Washington a lot more.
Yeah.
His struggles, I had no idea that he was fatherless at the age of 11.
Yeah.
But I think,
because the cherry tree story
is
that
this is great.
That's as a young child, and I'm sure this is something that children still hear today.
Yes.
Is that as a child, Washington chopped down a cherry tree, and his father came out and said, "Did you chop this down?" And he said, "I cannot tell a lie. I did it." What happened in reality was later in life, after his presidency, he had so many people coming to Mount Vernon to visit him, and he was a gracious host. Every time they would show up, they'd grab some cider or some red wine from
Madeira,
Jefferson.
maybe.
Yeah, some Madeira.
Yeah.
They would feed him, like all this stuff. So what he did was he went out. There was a fork in the road that was leading up to Mount Vernon on all the maps, and you were told when you hit the cherry trees at the fork in the road to take a right. So he went and chopped the cherry trees down so people couldn't find their way to his house where he was trying to live in retirement. And when a reporter asked him about it, he said, "Yeah, I'm not going to lie to you. I chopped the cherry tree down because I'm tired of people just showing up at my house." Like, that's paraphrasing, but
Sure.
But and then that story over time became a story we tell children to teach them to not lie.
Right. So this is what's interesting. So I'm so glad you brought that up about the cherry tree. There were other myths that came about Washington's life after his death. So there's this guy named Parson Mason Weems. He was a book peddler.
A nightmare of a name.
Well, Parson was his title. Mason Weems.
Oh, okay. Parson, like the song.
He was a preacher.
He was a snowman.
That's Parson Brown.
Oh, sorry.
Anyway, this guy's a book peddler. He's an Episcopal priest. He was eager to cash in. What?
He only eats fish. Got it.
That's pescatarian.
Oh, sorry.
Parson Mason Weems, shortly after Washington's death, was eager to cash in on Washington Mania, and he rushed out the first edition of The Life of Washington in pamphlet form. And he really manufactured enduring myths about Washington, like the cherry tree. There was another one, Praying Out of the Open at Valley Forge. Washington was a very private man. He was more of a deist than he was a Christian.
Yeah, that's something we
And he would have never have been so ostentatious as to say, I'm going to pray out in the open in front of all my troops. He was a very private man, more of an introvert already personally, but with his faith, he was very much more a deist than he would never have done that. And also there was another myth about Washington being so strong that he hurled a silver dollar across a river, the Rappahannock River, as a
silver dollar over that river over there.
How much you bet I could throw?
Coach would have put me and we would have taken state.
Good Napoleon Dynamite reference. Also, the silver dollar had John Kennedy's face on it, which was it was really weird. He's like, "Who's this guy? God, he's handsome." Massachusetts, I know that, but who's this Kennedy?
The deist part's interesting too, because the book talks a little bit about he really, really believed in freedom of religion, so much so that he didn't want people to have an idea of what his religion was because he was worried that people would think that should be their religion.
Correct. This was really interesting.
He would go to other religious ceremonies. I think he even visited a synagogue at one point.
Quaker, Presbyterian.
He hit them all because he wanted to show people whatever you believe, I'm down for it.
Yep.
And we built this so you can believe what you want to believe, and I don't want to push one thing on you.
He recited his prayers standing instead of kneeling, which was the common practice of the time. And he never took communion. We're getting a little into the little-known facts.
Yeah.
But he almost also never referred to Jesus Christ in any of his writings or speeches, preferring such vague locutions as providence, destiny, the author of our being, or simply heaven. So
you find ways to write words like locutions in your notes, don't you?
I wish there was a synonym for thesaurus.
Because my notes say stuff like, he really liked nice stuff. And your notes say locutions.
Well, Blaine, that's why we do this.
Yeah.
Let's drink again to George Washington. Cheers. Wherever you are, wherever you're listening to the Presiquential Podcast, we want to say thanks. As long as you're not in
a car or about to get in a car.
Oh, gosh. I hope you're not in a car drinking Horse Soldier. If you are, we need to have another conversation. You want to tie up his legacy at all before getting into little-known facts?
No, I mean, I'd like to think that we covered the things that we felt were important. That by no means is be all end all.
Yeah. I think Washington was a great man in our nation's history. By no means a perfect man.
Right.
But I think if anyone was going to be the guy who was going to free us from British colonialist rule and create this thing. Now, granted, he wasn't alone, but be the figurehead. Good grief. It's George Washington. I mean, there's almost there, as you read A Life by Ron Chernow, there's almost this providential, mystic, mythological vibe about Washington.
And if you look at the others in the same time period, right, you can find the things that makes them unqualified to do what Washington did. Because, like, John Adams was a little bit too elitist, a little bit too smart for everyone else, and kind of looked down on the people that weren't as smart as
Even though Washington literally looked down on everyone.
Correct. Yeah. At 6'4".
Good grief.
Hamilton had kind of like a little man syndrome almost.
Yeah.
Like he had to always prove something. And he would do that to the detriment of other people at times. Jefferson, boy.
Yeah. We'll get into that at episode 3.
Like there were plenty of reasons he couldn't have been this person.
Sure.
Franklin was too old and kind of a bit of a nut job.
Yeah.
Hancock might have been too ambitious. The Harrisons were a little too worried about their family lineage, which ended up working out okay for them.
Yeah.
If you kind of look at the other players, it seems like everybody kind of understood the right person to take these roles.
Yeah.
And this was a person that wanted from a young age to be a successful soldier, and he wanted to do it for his home country of England.
Yeah, soldier, yes. President, leader of the country at that point, probably not.
I mean, he tried to join the British Royal Navy.
Yeah.
And Fairfax, when that was turned down, talked him into being a surveyor. He ended up being a great surveyor.
Yeah. Well, actually, this was kind of cool as president, as he's exploring the new country. He's taking Dirk. You got an itch there, Dirk? You all right? That's Dirk, the podcast dog, just itching some fleas.
He's old, all right.
He's a 120-pound beast.
That is a myth.
Wow. Anyway, Washington would actually bring his old surveying equipment with him when he was president.
Right. Like it turned into like his retirement hobby.
You can take the boy out of Virginia, but you can't take the Virginian surveyor out of the president.
Sure.
That's how the old saying came to be.
That's exactly it.
Are you ready to dive into Washington's little-known facts?
Yes. Start with the teeth, please.
Oh, you want me to start with the teeth, Blaine?
Oh, we'll get to the teeth.
No,
let's.
Hey, you know
if
what?
you have to scroll.
No, I don't have to scroll.
On
let's go there.
Fancy digital notes.
What? You've got these all written out in a field notes notebook like some army guy?
Yes.
Good grief. Actually, you do. Okay, so when Washington was president, we've all heard about him having wooden teeth.
Wrong.
What?
Wrong.
No, he did not. He
bought them from poor people.
This was customary.
It is a nightmare.
This was normal.
For 13 shillings.
In 1784.
he would
13
buy
shillings a piece.
Yeah, he would buy teeth from poor people.
Not
and
just
be
teeth.
like, look, you need money, I need teeth. Like, let's
It
make
actually
this happen.
sounded like this. He bought 9 teeth from certain nameless, quote, Negroes, end quote, for 13 shillings apiece.
Yeah, and it was a normal thing rich people did
Yes.
back then. He also, at one point, lost a pair of dentures because he put them in port wine overnight.
I forgot about
and they got
this.
completely dyed purple. And his dentist was like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah, George.
Like, you can't. Why are you putting them? And he was like, "I don't know. It was there. You told me to put it in liquid overnight. It was on my mantle." Also, his dentist,
I know what you're about
John
to do.
Greenwood,
Go ahead.
which I'm just gonna assume is Lee Greenwood's great
Let's just say
grandfather,
he was the first guy to be proud to be an American.
studied dentistry
Under?
with Paul Revere.
There it is. I love Paul Revere. The music that you're hearing today is from my song Granary about American patriot Paul Revere.
That was a shameless plug.
Thank you,
I already
Blaine.
said that your music would be in the podcast.
You're a
right?
sweethart.
Yeah,
and a
you can
gentleman.
check that out on Spotify.
You can.
iTunes.
Go to
anywhere else.
ryansongs.com.
Yeah.
Yeah. Washington only had a single working tooth remaining by the time of his inauguration at 1789.
Whistle tooth.
Let me.
Yeah. Little known fact, amazing on the jug.
Oh, so good. Play it again, George. Take it. Oh my gosh. Okay, so you mentioned he never wore a wig. That's true. The state of Washington is the only state in our country to be named after a president.
But every town has a street named after him.
Literally every town.
Like, if you live in a town that doesn't have a Washington Street, look at the map again.
Yes. You're
There-
actually
it's
living in Honduras.
He famously didn't like jokes and really expected, like, you talked about the Esquire thing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So there was a moment where Hamilton convinced, I
Drink.
think it was Governor Morris, to go up to him and be like, "Hey, Washington, blah, blah, blah." It was a real Bob Knight situation. And he taps George Washington on the shoulder and goes, "Hey, Washington." And George Washington turns around and gives him the worst death stare on the planet that Governor Morris immediately knew he had done something so wrong.
Yeah.
And, like, was ready to beat the crap out of Hamilton
Yes.
for putting... And then, of course, like, the boys are just in the corner like, "Oh, I can't believe it."
He did it.
Like,
he
that
called
was-
him Washington.
That's what bros did back in the day.
I will cross the river and murder you if you ever do that again.
He was definitely up on the formalities.
Washington is known as the father of the American foxhound and kept more than 30 of this breed of dog. According to... Go
Was
ahead.
that what Lafayette sent? No, Lafayette sent him greyhounds, right?
It might have been greyhounds. Producer Russ
It was
looks that
greyhounds.
up. According
Stamp
to
it.
Washington's journals, 3 of the hounds' names were Drunkard, Tippler, and Tipsy. On Drunkard, on Tippler. Oh my gosh. He also pioneered the development of the American mule, a cross between a male donkey, Eeyore, and a female horse, and is revered by mule aficionados as the father of the American mule. So if you've ever rode a mule before or seen a picture of one,
Who hasn't?
well, if you go to the North Rim of the Grand Canyon, Blaine, like I have,
Oh, okay.
and ride down in a mule, you've got a George Washington thing. Washington was also one of the sickliest presidents ever. Throughout his life, he suffered from diphtheria, tuberculosis, smallpox, dysentery, malaria, tonsillitis, and pneumonia, to name a few.
And gingivitis.
Washington most definitely would have gotten COVID-19 if he were around
French
today.
hounds.
French hounds.
That's what Lafayette gave him. 7 French hounds.
Or if you're from France, hounds.
which Lafayette famously was.
Yeah, he was. God, I love this guy. Oh man. Oh, we got a kid.
Like,
what are we gonna name
I brought
him?
you all these dogs, and they're like, look at all our French hounds. And he was like,
They're just called dogs here. Just dogs. I got you dogs.
Yeah, and they're like, no, they're French hounds.
No, what?
Yeah, I sent them over with your president's kid.
John Quincy, just a plastic bag of French dog poo.
For a moment,
Yeah, go
for
ahead.
a little known fact, talk a little bit more about Mary Ball Washington.
Oh, God, I didn't even realize that I said that.
We know. It was great.
Ball Washington.
She was a terrorist.
She was horrible.
Like, she was the original Kardashian mom. So she, like, tried to stop him from joining the Navy, and then tried to stop him from joining the Army.
Okay.
And then was, like, just mad all the time. Every time he was up for a promotion,
Gosh.
she was like, no, come back to the ranch. Come back and do work. And, like, I mean, it was his life goal to get away from her.
Gosh.
And she was just a nightmare of a human.
She was.
It was like, I mean, I don't want to get too far into it. Like, if you want to learn more about it, it's in like the first 300 pages of this book.
You have fun with that. The good news is you can buy it on Amazon for $50.
Oh, it's cheaper than that.
I know, I'm just kidding. Washington,
Okay,
I did
facts.
not know this. Some more little known facts. In 1789, Washington's presidential salary was 2% of the total U.S. budget. The dude was balling. 2% of the entire country's budget was his salary.
And he still died penniless.
Still was poor.
One of the, like, first in a long line of presidents
Yes.
who died land rich and cash poor.
A lot of Virginians, right?
Oh, a lot of Virginians.
I mean, that Virginian dynasty. He actually had to borrow money to attend his own inauguration, the first one.
Yeah.
Gosh. Okay, Blaine, check this out. If you don't count Bill Pullman in Independence Day,
Okay. All right.
George Washington is the only president to personally lead troops in the field while serving as POTUS.
Okay.
On September 19th, 1794, he led 13,000 federalized militia troops on a nearly month-long march west over the Allegheny Mountains in Pennsylvania to survey the so-called Whiskey Rebellion.
Yeah. He was not the first to receive fire, which I believe is a source of contention between Madison and Lincoln. No, Monroe and
Monroe,
Lincoln.
yeah.
Monroe and Lincoln. Depending on how you define receive fire.
Okay.
Each of them did in different ways, which we will dive into.
We'll dive
later.
into that.
Yeah.
But basically, he leads all these troops west. He, the people who are, they're the rebels in the Whiskey Rebellion, which if you want to dive into that, there's the internet for
Yeah.
that.
There's, they're just doing the thing we did with tea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did.
They're like, it was fine before.
Hey, let's do it.
Yeah.
Everyone else was jumping off a bridge. I'd jump off it
Yeah.
too. Well, he basically hands off the troops and goes back to Philadelphia. But first and only president to lead troops in the field. At Mount Vernon, he grew hemp and ran a profitable distillery that made 12,000 gallons of whiskey a year. Washington knew how to throw down.
Yeah. Well, the hemp was used for like lots of different things.
Was it?
Very strong material. They used it. Oh, yeah.
It wasn't just CBD lotions.
It's just popping up on every corner. Like the fireworks store goes away.
No, literally,
you could Washington hemp.
You could feed this to your French hounds for their anxiety. Lafayette's like, you mean our dogs?
What happened to the fireworks store? This used to be a marsh.
Marsh Supermarkets. Shout out to Marsh. We're in Indiana. Oh, God. When Washington died, he was a lieutenant general. But as the centuries passed, this 3-star rank did not seem commensurate with what he had actually accomplished. So, I did not know this. In 1976, a law was passed to make Washington the highest-ranking U.S. officer of all time. General of the Armies of the United States. Nobody will ever outrank George Washington in the military.
Well,
okay, now
with
you're
the way
the military
things are
man.
going, we don't know.
To date.
Like we could make up things.
Right.
We have been.
Lord Protectorate of the Universe. Those were some good little known facts right there about George Washington.
Yeah, and I hope that we did him justice.
I think we did.
Yeah.
For not being presidential experts at all and reading one book.
That'll be the theme.
I think we did a good job.
Yeah.
Way to go, us. Hey, thank you for listening to the Presiquential Podcast. However you find us, wherever you are, thank you. If you loved this episode, please subscribe, share it with a fellow history buff, and leave a review. Also, be sure to follow us on all the social media platforms at Presiquential. That's PRESIQUENTIAL. Our next episode on John Adams will be released on Wednesday, February 3rd, 2021. Until then, thank you for listening to episode 1, The Father of the Presiquential Podcast. We'll see you next time.